Maseches Gittin Daf Ayin test begins with a Mishnah and contains 1.5 additional Mishnayos. So the first Mishnah discusses the sugya of airspace, when airspace could be kaina. The Gemara will explain the cases of the Mishnah. And then the next Mishnah will talk about a get yashan, that is a get that there was yichud after the get was written. And then there is a very lengthy Mishnah that begins on this daf and continues deep into the next daf. So let's begin. The Gemara is discussing airspace. So we have two cases. We have a man who throws a get to his wife, and there's a roof and a ground floor. And in the first case, the man is on the ground and he throws it to his wife on the roof. In the second case, the man is on the roof and he throws it to his wife, who is on the ground, neighboring the building that he's on the roof. So the two cases, the Gemara paskins that as soon as the get gets into the airspace of the woman's rishus, the gerushin is chal. So if the husband's on the floor and he throws it onto the roof, as soon as it crosses over the edge of the building into the airspace of the roof, she's mekureshes. The same way, if he is on the roof and he throws it as soon as it gets off the airspace of the roof, and she's on the yard, which is right next to the building, then she is divorced. If she never receives it, that is, it starts to rain and the get gets erased before it lands, or it gets burned, she's divorced anyway, because the get is chal as soon as it enters her respective airspace. So the Gemara begins, the Gemara wants to know, there's a problem that it's not protected. In order for the get to be considered to have landed, and for her to have received it, it has to be guarded, she has to have access to it. Over here, when it's floating in the air, it hasn't landed yet, the wind could just blow it away. Now, even if the wind doesn't blow it away, since it could blow it away, it hasn't landed, and if it gets destroyed, it should never be chal. It should have to be protected. So the Gemara answers two answers. One answer is that it is within 3 tefachim of the surface of the roof. So if the woman's on the roof, as soon as the get arrives within 3 tefachim of the roof, then it's considered to be on the floor already. Anything that's within 3 tefachim of a surface is like it's on the surface, therefore it's landed already. Now, the Gemara's other answer, there was a number of Talmidei Chachamim who say this, is that there's a fence, and it's within the fence. So if the woman's on the roof, there's a fence around the roof, and it drops to lower than the top of the fence. And if she's on the ground, you have to say that the fence of the chutzner actually extends higher than the fence of the roof. So that when it exits the airspace of the roof, it is in the airspace of the chutzner, and it's within her fence. It's within the fence of the chutzner. Now, there's a number of Talmidei Chachamim who say this. Somewhere says Rabbi Yehuda Bar Shmuel brings it at first. He says it for both the roof and the yard, and then the Gemara brings Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Oishia, Ula and Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Abba asks a question to Ula. Now, the Gemara says that the question we have here is this only in accordance with the Rebbe's opinion? We have a Machlekes Masechah Shabbos is about what's called kolot kehunach. When something is in the air, is it considered to be landed? Do we view it in lumnus as if it has landed on the ground there? Now in Hilchos Shabbos it's nageya to whether one violates carrying if you throw something from Rishus Harabim through Rishus Yachid and it lands in another Rishus Harabim. So if you don't view it as ever having landed, so it goes from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Harabim, there's no carrying deraisa. In order to violate carrying deraisa, it has to go from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid or vice versa. According to Rebbe, when it passes through the Rishus Yachid, you view it as if it landed, and therefore went from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid, and it's in Issa Daraisa. So the Gemara wants to say, so this is like Rebbe's opinion, that as long as it's within the airspace, it's considered to have landed. So the Gemara says a number of Talmidei Chachamim again who say that no, the Rabbanan would agree to this as well. And that's because the Rabbanan only argued in Hilchos Shabbos is it considered to be on the ground as far as doing a hanacha in the definition of the malach of carrying. Here we're talking about being protected. Once it's within the fence, it's protected, and the woman is considered to have control over it, and therefore the Rabbanan would agree as well. Gemara now brings a few halachas. The Gemara moves on to the next line in the Mishnah. We had said that if the get is erased, once it has crossed into her airspace, it doesn't matter if she's divorced anyway. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman is the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, it's only if the get was already falling. That is, the husband threw it in an arc to get over the fence. So if it crossed the fence, but it's still climbing, it's still heading upwards, and it gets destroyed in its upward part of the arc, that is, she's not megareshes. And the reason is because it's moving away from her and there's no nesina. In order to fulfill v'nasam b'yah, that has to be moving towards her, coming down to her. Even though it's in her rishus, as long as it's rising away from her, that does not count, and she's not divorced if it gets destroyed at that point. Now, as far as the next line in that mission was that if it gets burned, the Gemara assumes that the fire is on the floor. So if it got burned, obviously it was falling into the fire. So the Gemara says here, the detail that we need to keep in mind is that the fire had to have arrived after the get was set in motion, once the get was thrown. That way, when the get was thrown, the throw was heading to a nice safe landing, and the fire came afterwards. But if the get was thrown to the fire was there already, then the entire throw was heading to the fire all along, and therefore it was never heading to her, never heading to her shus. It was never under her control, and she's not divorced. Right now, the Gemara brings the halacha of Reb Chisda, which the Gemara is going to try to prove from our Mishnah and reject. So Reb Chisda says that no one gives away, no one loans two different parts of his rishus to his wife to be makabel of the get. So the husband, maybe he'll loan her the chutzner to be makabel of the get, maybe he'll loan her the roof, but not both, not more than one. So Rav Ami Bar Chama said to Rava, how does the old man, how does the Chizda know this? So he said, if you look in the Mishnah, you could see it. Because in the Mishnah, we have the case of where the wife's on the roof and the husband's on the floor, or the wife's on the floor and the husband's on the roof. Now, who owns what? And we go through the options here. If the wife owns all of them, it should make a difference when it crosses from one airspace to another. The wife owns them all. If the husband owns all of them, it still should make a difference. If it crosses from one airspace to another, it's not in the woman's airspace at all. So it has to be that the husband owns one of the two rishuyos and the wife owns the other one. The problem is that it's contradictory. Which does he own? If the husband owns the roof and the wife owns the ground, so then it doesn't make sense why if the get crosses into the roof when the woman owns it, that she should be divorced. And if it's the other way around, the woman owns the yard and the man, if the man that is owns the yard and the woman owns the roof, it would make sense why when it crosses into the yard, the airspace of the yard, that the get should be echal. So you got to say that in the first case where the woman's on the roof, she owns the roof and the husband owns the yard. And in the second case where the woman's on the ground, she owns the ground and the husband owns the yard. That doesn't make sense to say that the first case and the second case are talking about two different cases. Usually it's parallel in all the factors except the ones that we're focusing on. So therefore it has to be that the husband owns them all and he loaned them to her. Now, if he loaned them to her, what you see here is that he only lends her one at a time, either the roof or the ground and not both of them, and that's why he has to throw it to her where she is. So the Gemara rejects this. This is not a proof to this. It could just be that the Reish and the Sefer are talking about two different cases. Wherever she is the one she owns. Wherever he is the one he owns. In the first case, she's got the roof and he's got the ground. In the second case, she's got the ground and he's got the roof. Not a kasha. And the Gemara now points out three ways in which Hilchas Gittin is different than Hilchas Shabbos. So the first one we mentioned already, we said there's a machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbanan in Hilchas Shabbos, whether Kluta Kahuna, whether if it's passing through a Rishus Yachid, is it like it's on the ground in Rishus Yachid, and therefore it's gone from one Rishus to another, and there's an issue carrying Dairaisa. Like we said, that's only machlokes in Hilchas Shabbos, but the Rabbanan agree in Hilchas Gittin that it is considered to be protected when it's passing through, and therefore it is on the ground, and it is chal. The get is chal, even though they don't hold that in Hilchas Shabbos. Now, the second is halacha of Reb Chisda. Reb Chisda says that if somebody has a pole 100 ams tall with a basket at the top of the pole, it's in Rishus HaYachid, and he's standing in Rishus HaRabim, and he throws an object on Shabbos from Rishus HaRabim onto the basket, even if it's 100 amos tall. So he violates an Rishus HaRabim because the Rishus HaYachid goes all the way up to the heavens. There's no upper limit to Rishus HaYachid. Rishus HaRabim has an upper limit. It's only 10 amos high. It's only 10 tefachim high. But the Rishus HaYachid continues all the way up. So the basket is considered Rishus HaYachid, and he threw from the Rishus HaRabim where he is to the Rishus HaYachid where the basket is. Now that's only true in Hilchas Shabbos, where you view the object that lands in the basket as if it's on the ground in Rishus HaYachid, and it is Rishus to Rishus. However, if someone were to throw a get into a basket that's at the top of 100 on a stick, that would not be chal because the wind's going to blow it out of the Rishus HaYachid, out of the chutzner, and it's not under control. And a chutzner only is kaina if it is under the control of the person who it's being kaina for. That's the second halacha. And the third halacha is talking about two roofs that are near each other. So if two roofs that are near each other belong to different people, so they are considered to be different rishuyos, and even though they're both rishus yachid, but to carry from one to the other, you need an eruv chatzeros. And just like the houses below, to go from one house to the other house, you would have to have an eruv chatzeros. The roofs above, you would have to have an eruv chatzeros. You can't take water from one roof and bring it to the other roof. Now, in Gittin, it's not that way. If a husband has two homes near each other, and he lends the roof of one of them to his wife, she could be makabel get as soon as it goes onto the other roof as well. Because there's no difference. We don't care about the two rishuyos on the roof. Based on the rishuyos of the homes underneath, we view it all as one big rishus. Now, the Gemara brings another halacha. Abaye says, what happens if you have one courtyard within another courtyard, fully surrounded by the outer courtyard? You have an outer courtyard and an inner courtyard. The inner courtyard belongs to the woman. The outer courtyard belongs to the man. And the fence surrounding the outer courtyard is higher than the fence of the inner courtyard. It says Abaye, as soon as let's say the husband is standing outside both courtyards, he throws the get. As soon as it crosses over the fence of the outer courtyard, it is kinda the get for the woman, and she's divorced even before it goes into the airspace of the inner courtyard. And what's the reason? Because the fence of the outer courtyard also protects the inner courtyard, and therefore that fence works for the woman who owns the inner courtyard. So as soon as if the fence is in her employ, and therefore it protects it for her, it's considered to be in her rishus, in her protection, even though it's not in her airspace at all. Now, the Gemara says this only works for courtyards. It does not work for boxes. So let's say there's a box within a box. She owns the inner box and he owns the outer box. The fact that it's in the airspace of the outer box doesn't make a difference. She's not kinda. And the reason is that a kli doesn't have airspace. Airspace is a courtyard or a roof. It's a land principle. A kli is airspace means nothing. It has to actually land in her box in order for the box to be kinda for her. So Gemara asks, but it's kalov, it's the kli of the purchaser inside the property of the seller, because her box is inside the box of her husband. The rule is, if the one who's receiving something has a kli and it's inside the property of the one who's giving it, it's not chal for her, not chal for him or her. So here, the inner box is inside the outer box. How does it work? So the outer box doesn't have a bottom. We're talking about where the outer box is just walls, and therefore the inner box is not in the outer box. It's just surrounded by the walls of the outer box itself. Okay, this concludes the Gemara. Now we get to our next Mishnah. Short Mishnah discussing the concept of a get yashan. So Beis Shammai says a person is allowed to use a get yashan, and Beis Hillel says you cannot use a get yashan. What's a get yashan? The Mishnah defines a get yashan as any time where there was yichud between the husband and the wife after the get has already been written. The Gemara briefly explains the machlokes and has one brief comment. Gemara says the reason Beis Hillel says you cannot use the get yashan is because we are afraid she may give birth to a child later than the date that's written on the get. People will forget that the get wasn't given until after the child was born. They'll assume it was given before because that's the date on it, and therefore they will assume that the child was born out of wedlock, which is a pekam. So that means, let's say the get was written 3 years before it's used, then they have yichud, and then they have bia, and then she gets pregnant and she has a child. And then later the get is given, and then many years later people forget about the whole story. They just see that the date on the get predates the birthday of the child. That is a major problem. Because we're afraid that that's going to happen, we don't allow a get to be used once yichud happened after the date on the get. Beis Shammai is not worried about that, and they say that's unlikely to happen, therefore they don't make such a gzeira. Now, the Gemara says, Rav Abba says, Shmuel, we do allow, even Beis Hillel, we do allow the get yashan in some circumstances. So if she already got the get and she got remarried based on the get, we're not going to say she has to get divorced from that person because the original get from her first husband is not valid. We do allow it to stand in that circumstances. Another version of what Abba said in the name of Shmuel was that if she just got divorced, then she can stay divorced. That means, let's say she got divorced and her husband disappeared, went to Medina Sayyam, you don't have to call her an aguna or even an almana. You could rely on the fact that she has this get, even though it's a get yashan, and even Beis Hillel would agree to that.